Welcome to the Analysis.news podcast. I'm Paul J. Now joining us to discuss the debate many are calling the shit show debate is Larry Wilkerson. He's a retired United States Army colonel, former chief of staff to United States Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he's a distinguished adjunct professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. And we'll also be talking about a meeting that took place earlier Thursday of the National Task Force for Election Crises that Larry is part of. Thanks for joining us, Larry.
Good to be with you, Paul.
So we'll start with you're watching it, and what's your impression as this crazy thing evolves?
Yeah, my impression of the debates, Trump and Biden, of course, was more or less what several people on the conference call of the National Task Force today indicated. And that was even deeper concern, more profound concern than perhaps we had before. And it was pretty profound before that there are infinite ways to derail the elections coming up on 3 November. And probably more to the point that this president was probably capable of walking down the path to any one of those ways and conclusions. So it made us, if anything, more frightened and more concentrated and concerned and more willing to work 24/7 to do everything we can to possibly prevent the more dire circumstances that might develop.
When you looked at Trump, who was kind of melting down, because I thought his strategy of heckling and interrupting meant to really disrupt and throw Biden off his game, might have worked, except that he wasn't expecting that the moderator Wallace would jump in and actually lend some sanity to the process and stop him to a large extent from executing on the policy. But as you watch Trump roll his eyes and make the strangest of faces, I was really thought Biden missed an obvious opportunity. In fact, he missed many obvious opportunities, but to just look at Trump and then look at Wallace and say, do you want this man to decide whether to launch a nuclear weapon? the guy was going crazy before our eyes.
I felt similar impulses, but I always have to remind myself that now, having been behind the camera a number of times myself, that you don't always see what the viewer sees if you're a participant, and you don't realize, perhaps on a timely basis at least, and maybe not at all, that these opportunities are having. And let me hasten to add that one of the impressions I took away, and one of the impressions I in part try to convey today, was that this guy's all bluster. This guy's all rhetoric. This guy's all lies. This guy's all brinksmanship. This guy's all feigned belligerency. He's talking to not his, quote, base, unquote, anymore. He's talking to the core of that base. He's talking to people like the Proud Boys. He's talking to people like the neo-Nazi groups all across this country, incidentally, about whom the FBI is deeply concerned. He's talking to the core of his base, and he's titillated by that, and they're titillated by him. The more he does it, the more he becomes insane, and the more they become insane. If there's anything that worries me, that's the aspect of it. But I am no longer worried about this man winning the election on November the 3rd. He is going to lose overwhelmingly. The problem in my mind is going to be how he leaves.
The National Task Force for Election Crises. Just quickly, who's on it? What's it supposed to be doing? And because it's both Republicans and Democrats, right?
It's all manner. It's Republicans, Democrats, independents. I suspect there might be a Wiccan or, a Jedi Knight on it. I don't know. There are about 60 to 65 of us at any given time. And we are primarily lawyers. And I have come to find some of the very best lawyers in the country, particularly those lawyers we have who are, and I'll name this particular one because he's said it was okay to name him, like Ned Foley from the law school at the Iowa State University, who is one of the leading constitutional and electoral politics scholars in the country. And though Ned will talk you to death on the details of the law and so forth, you are arrested by his knowledge, and you usually listen because he knows what he's talking about. This group of people who are, as I said, mostly lawyers, are focused on that aspect of the elections, which I think, given the nature of our democracy, given the nature of our institutions, is probably at the end of the day the most important. And that's the constitutional/legal aspects of it. What does the Electoral Control Act say? What doesn't it say? What does the Constitution say? What doesn't it say? We've learned, for example, you could drive a Mack truck through the holes in the Constitution. And one of the things we're going to do is record all of this and hopefully put a team of lawyers to work with the Congress in the new year on legislation to fix some of these things. But it's too late now, of course. So we're just working to convince people that the institutions that are here, the laws that are here, if they're treated with the least bit of respect and decency, we can get through this. But one of the aspects of the National Task Force is to make sure that the law is followed, the Constitution is followed, and that as best as possible, we bring all manner of court action if it isn't. And we know that our opponents are going to do the same thing. Indeed, they've been doing it already for quite some time, and we've been meeting them on the field of battle, so to speak, for quite some time, as have the states and the precincts and, in general, everyone involved in this across the country, because the primaries, of course, have been going on for some time. So that's the predominant nature of the task force. But we're also involved with experts in national security, experts in domestic affairs, if you will, politics, better term. And there are people like Michael Chertoff. I can also mention him because he's let it be known that he's associated with the task force, who are looking at it from a more broader perspective and looking at it from the kinds of things that can happen outside the law or that might even be extra legal or legal, but they are only so because, for example, the Attorney General makes them so under the president's auspices. And we have no faith in Barr being a person who will carry out the letter of the law as we see the law. So this task force is composed of all manner of people, but it's predominantly lawyers looking at it through a legal lens, if you will.
In the right-wing press, the scenario they're talking about, and you can hear it anywhere from Tucker Carlson to Steve Bannon to various websites, accusing that it will be the Biden forces that are going to try to stage a coup. And it looks like that Democratic states that vote for Trump, that the governors will not certify, the legislatures, if they're controlled by Democrats, will choose different electors, essentially defying the Trump win in the vote. And I think it's an interesting accusation against the Biden forces, because that's exactly the plan that people think Trump is cooking up, or Trump's forces are cooking up, to get Republican states not to certify. In either case, it's even more of a shit show than the debate was. And so in your meeting, I guess you guys have been considering this kind of a mess where you could have some Republican governors doing it one way. I don't know what Democratic governors do. What does this look like? Because one way or the other, unless it's an overwhelming Biden win on the 3rd, it looks like an enormous mess.
I take your point there. We take your point there. We think the best scenario is a overwhelming win in the Electoral College and the popular vote by Biden, even so overwhelming that you can pretty much call it by election night. We don't think that is probably going to happen, but we wish it would, because I think that would put a lot of our fears to rest. We then would only have to deal with the possibility that Trump might call his base to the streets with their guns, and then we're off to the races there. But let me back up just a little bit and make some comments on your comments. Ned Foley, the lawyer I was speaking to before, has written extensively on the one state where the scenario you were briefly describing might play out and might play out the most dangerously, and of course that's Pennsylvania. We might actually have a governor of one party who decides to base his electoral slate on the determination actually happening in the state. That is to say, all votes counted, including absentee and early voting and mail-in voting. We might have a legislature that concludes it wants to send up another slate of electors because it thinks that all that later voting was fraudulent. And so you get a couple of slates going to Washington, which one is to be accepted. Ned has written on this extensively, and the Electoral Control Act and the law itself is pretty clear on this, although it is vague in places. And in those places, as I said, you could drive a Mack truck. But I think Ned's right in the sense that it would resolve itself properly if everyone just stays cool and calm and follows the act and the law. The problem comes in when people in the chain, as it were, don't. And that's where the Republicans really trouble us. We're not troubled in that sense by the left. We do posit the possibility, and one of our simulations demonstrated the possibility, that the left might be somewhat willing to go to the streets and so forth and to complain and scream and holler in a way that is injurious to a free and fair and smooth running election. If they were wiped out in the Electoral College and maybe they won the popular vote, for example, as happened in 2016, that's going to be difficult for the left to swallow again. I think it's going to be difficult for America to swallow again. But most of the tension came when the situation resolved itself through the law, through the process that it should resolve itself through, and the other side wouldn't accept the results, in this case, the other side being the Trump side. That's where we see all kinds of problems developing. And again, it's not because the system didn't work. The system did work. It's just that the other side doesn't want to accept it.
How do you explain how the Republican Party, which represents and very closely connected to serious companies and corporations in the financial sector, military industrial complex, and so on and so on. And not the whole party. There's certainly members of the House and otherwise that represent the real fringe elements, but the more senior leadership represent a significant section of the elites. And if it wasn't clear before, it should be clearer now, and certainly by that debate, that Trump is unhinged. And there's a lot of the books that have come out and so on. And this could, even if he kind of finds a way to stay in power, in the long run, one would think this destroys the Republican Party. And I guess what I'm getting at is, the sort of senior leadership of the Republican Party, are they just so scared of Trump's base that they can't move away?
That's part of it, Paul. And you see that most vividly in some of the local elections where you'll have a person like Lindsey Graham, for example, who will get more and more insane simply because he's being challenged in a primary by someone even to the right of him. And he's afraid that person will attract Trumpsters to the extent that he'll beat him in the primary. And that's happened all across the country with Republicans.
Now he might get beat by a Democrat.
Yes. I just sent some money to Jamie. I hope he does beat him. But you've touched on something that I've really given some heavy thought to. Over the last year or so, I've done a lot of work on the Hill. Actually, the last 2 years, a lot of work on the Hill in the Senate and the House with regard to a number of issues, the Yemen conflict, for example, and the war power in general. I've been in Mark Meadows' office, and I understand how absolutely un-American Mark Meadows is. He's a North Carolinian who could fit right in, Gone with the Wind. He could be an overseer for slaves on Tara's plantation. I've seen these people up close and personal, Paul, and let me tell you, they're not the elite. They are anything but the elite. And that's our fault as citizens. That's our fault all across this country in 50 states, with very little exception. And I never thought I would say this. With very little exception, the people in the Congress are mediocre. They're extraordinarily mediocre. And what they do is spend all their time on the phone enhancing their mediocrity by raising money that then commits them in ways that they'll never admit to, but they are in fact indeed committed to. This is money from the military-industrial complex. It's money from big food, from big oil, from big pharmacy. You name it. If it's big and corporate and got money, they buy congressmen. And these people are eminently purchasable because they are not elite. At best, they're mediocre. And so when you start talking about why do they do this or why did they do that, it's clear to me now why they do it, because that's the side of the bread that they interpret is buttered for them on Monday. And if it were buttered on the other side on Tuesday, they would look like a yo-yo. They are just not quality people, Paul.
So let's go back to the National Task Force. So what is it? Assuming the scenario is there's not an overwhelming Biden victory on November 3rd, and there is this legal craziness that follows, what does the task force think can be done, and what is it planning to do? What does it think could be done, and doesn't there need to be? Assuming, no, I shouldn't say assuming, but if in fact enough Republican-controlled states try to essentially control the outcome of the election, doesn't there have to be a mass participation on the streets on a scale maybe not seen before?
Well, the citizen in me says absolutely correct. If this election is stolen, and clearly it's stolen, then there ought to be 200 million Americans out on the streets, not with guns, not with any kind of violence or forethought, but with the idea that I'm going to protest until something happens to correct this clearly illegal and unconstitutional situation. But I don't think it's going to come to that, because I'm increasingly of a mind that it's going to be a blowout, and it's going to be a blowout in both the Electoral College and the popular vote. And what I saw at the debates, to go back to your initial question, the way you opened this interview, what I saw at the debates just enhanced my feeling tenfold in that regard. I cannot imagine that after watching that man on that stage, I'm told 70 million people watch that we're going to get a majority vote in this country, or even a majority in the Electoral College, for that man. I just can't imagine it. And it's not going to get better. It's going to be the same or worse as we go forward. And I don't look for him to win any friends and enemies either as he moves forward to November the 3rd, because he is becoming unhinged. And frankly, the more unhinged he becomes, the more worried I become. On one hand, I learned the other day, for example, if Politico magazine is right, that he actually directed the Northern Command commander to unlimber the nuclear weapons and upload them on their various delivery platforms. This allegedly to put some pressure on Putin so that when we go into the February renegotiations or negotiations on continuing the strategic arms talks and the treaty, that he'll have leverage. That's a broad assumption on his part that he will be there in February. I don't think he will, but it just shows you the kind of insanity this man is capable of. And it's been rhetoric up to this point. His rhetoric with regard to North Korea, Kim Jong-un, his rhetoric with regard to Iran, with regard to Venezuela, has been just that, rhetoric. But who knows at what moment the man is going to actually order something to happen that's going to be very detrimental to the interests of the United States and possibly kill some people in the world for no other reason than the president says to do it. This is what worries me. He's becoming increasingly unhinged, and there seems to be, you asked about the Congress, Paul. You asked, why do those Republicans like McConnell and Cotton and Cruz and Graham still support the man when they can clearly see he is destroying the vestiges of the Republican Party? Whatever's left of it, he's destroying. Why do they continue to support him? Well, it's the same thing with the entourage around him. There are people there who ought to know better. There are people there that have seen him up close and personal. There are people there that know that the things Woodward wrote about him, that McMaster and others said about him, are absolutely correct. They know what kind of man this is, and yet they tolerate him because he is their access to power. These are despicable people. These are disgusting people. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, are they willing to go down with the Titanic in order to clutch to their deck chair as they drown? I don't know.
Too late to change now, isn't it?
Yeah, well, why not? Why not invoke the 25th Amendment and put Pence in there?
Well, maybe that happens after November 3rd so he can get his pardon and such. If all his shenanigans don't work. But if he tries some kind of October surprise vis-a-vis Iran or something like that, some military adventure, will the military go along with it? Do they have any choice?
I can't imagine that there isn't something already going on, at least at the Pentagon, if not elsewhere too, and I suspect it's elsewhere too. There have got to be at the third and fourth levels, I think, of the so-called deep state, which is nothing more than the bureaucracy, people who are thinking about these sorts of things, just as they did with Richard Nixon when Richard Nixon was, having a bottle of Jack Daniels by 5 o'clock every day during Watergate. There have got to be people who are saying things. I would not put this past Mark Esper, for example, the Secretary of Defense. If I get an order that I don't think is right, I'm not going to carry it out. I'm not going to pass it on to be carried out. I can't imagine that kind of thing could happen with people who have any respect for themselves whatsoever. And Esper's one of the people I think does have some respect for himself and some respect for the position he's in, and certainly some respect for the continuity of government and the continuity of this republic. So I can't imagine that we'd have a situation where everyone would, just as with Hitler, about the time Hitler proved that he was smart, quote unquote, by having his enemies fall before him one after the other, including in the spring of 1940, France. And that reinforced everything with all the people he needed to reinforce it with. And so he was off to the races. I can't imagine that happening with Trump. There are just too many institutions and too many people around him that will keep that from happening. Hitler had nothing around him but the Wehrmacht and the Prussian elite who thought, well, we can control him, so we'll let him go on and do it. And then he started victory after victory after victory, such as they were. And the Wehrmacht leadership and the Prussians in it said essentially, wow, this is pretty neat. The guy does accomplish things. That ain't going to happen with Trump. Trump doesn't accomplish anything. The man's a bankrupt. He's a man who couldn't even run a business. He couldn't even take $400 million from his father and turn it into more money. He's lived off debt his whole life. The first time he ever encountered any kind of money making was when he sold himself to reality TV. He's like a world wrestling dude, he gets in the ring and throws people around and it's all fake, but you make money from it. That's Donald Trump. No one's going to follow him anywhere, I don't think.
Well, then he's got to be preoccupied with his personal exit then pretty soon.
I think so. What's he going to do when he leaves? And this has probably got to be one of the biggest motivators for him not to want to leave, because they're going to put him in jail.
Yeah, even a Pence pardon doesn't cover his ass in New York, and there's so much building up against him in New York.
You'd think so. I mean, this pardon business is getting out of hand anyway. We need to take a look at that hard after we get a new president in there. It's abused. It's just terribly abused.
Well, thanks for joining us, Larry.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
And thank you for joining us on the Analysis.News podcast.